The crisp, cold air at Arlington National Cemetery carried the weight of sorrow, thick and unshakable. The overcast sky hung low, a mirror to the grief that gripped those gathered. Rows upon rows of uniformed soldiers stood at unwavering attention, their medals catching the dim gray light, reflecting a solemn glint. Their faces were set, expressions grim, bodies rigid with discipline and respect. In the front row, a widow clutched a folded American flag, her fingers trembling as they gripped the only tangible piece of the man she had lost. Tears streaked down her face, silent, endless, as if mourning could carve itself into her very soul. The fabric of the flag, once a proud symbol of honor, now felt unbearably heavy in her grasp, a final connection to the love she would never hold again. Standing at the forefront of the ceremony was General Nathaniel Carter, his crisp dress uniform immaculate, the pristine white of his gloves stark against his deep brown skin. His posture was unyielding, his expression unreadable behind the dark aviators shielding his eyes. A man who had led troops into battle, who had commanded thousands, who had seen loss and devastation beyond measure. Yet today, none of that mattered. Today was personal. The man being laid to rest, Major William Daniels, had been more than a soldier. He had been a brother in arms, a mentee, a friend. Carter had guided him from his first uncertain steps as a fresh recruit to the moment he became a decorated officer, standing proud among the ranks. And now, he was gone, taken by an IED in the blistering heat of a distant desert. The finality of it was suffocating. The ceremony was drawing to its inevitable close. The 21-gun salute had thundered through the hills, a parting gesture of honor and sacrifice. The last note of the bugle had faded into the wind, carried away like a whisper of memory. Now, all that remained was the final goodbye. Carter inhaled sharply, steeling himself for what came next. He took a measured step forward, preparing to pay his respects. But then, a sudden, sharp voice shattered the quiet. "Get down. Hands where I can see, Gasps rippled through the mourners like a shockwave. Heads snapped toward the commotion, eyes widening in disbelief. At the edge of the funeral gathering, two uniformed police officers stood, their weapons drawn, aimed directly at General Carter. The younger officer, barely past his academy days, shifted nervously, his fingers twitching over his holster. His hesitation was clear. But the other, Sergeant Doug Harper, stood firm. A burly, middle-aged man with a hardened scowl etched into his face, he exuded a confidence laced with something darker. His finger hovered near the trigger, ready, certain. Carter did not move. Murmurs of shock spread through the soldiers. Some instinctively reached for their holsters, only to remember they were unarmed in the presence of grief and remembrance. Major Daniels' widow let out a horrified sob, her knuckles white around the flag in her grasp. Carter's voice, when it came, was calm, controlled. The voice of a man who had commanded troops under enemy fire, who had faced life-and-death decisions without a second of hesitation. "What do you think you're doing?" His baritone carried, sharp as steel, cutting through the charged silence. Harper stepped closer, his grip tightening, his stance unwavering. "I said hands up."
"Now?"
The tension thickened, suffocating, pressing against the air itself. No one moved. No one breathed. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the cold wind, the distant shift of boots against damp grass. Nathaniel Carter, 4-star general, combat veteran, war hero. He stood unflinching, his shoulders squared, his gaze locked onto Harper's. He had been in war zones, had stared down enemies with deadly intent. But this was different. This was something uglier. "You're making a mistake," Carter said, his voice steady, unwavering. Harper's lip curled, his knuckles whitening around the gun. "Oh yeah? And what mistake is that?" Carter tilted his head slightly. His tone dropped, quiet, controlled, dangerous in its restraint. The kind of voice that had ended careers, toppled arrogance, and commanded entire battlefields. But Harper wasn't listening. The officer had no idea who he was dealing with. And he was about to learn the hard way. Gasps continued to ripple through the mourners, the honor guard exchanging tense, bewildered glances. Their hands clenched at their sides, their bodies vibrating with restrained fury. This wasn't some random civilian being targeted. This wasn't a man on the fringes of society. This was General Nathaniel Carter, one of the most respected military leaders in the country. And yet, Harper's gun remained trained on him, as if he were nothing more than a common criminal. The air grew thick with silence, so dense it was suffocating. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the cemetery trees and the low, distant roll of thunder on the horizon. Carter had yet to move. His chest rose and fell in measured control, his presence unwavering. But his eyes, those dark, knowing eyes, locked onto Harper with an intensity that sent a chill through even the most hardened soldiers present. Harper's voice rose again, his command laced with something far more insidious than authority. I said hands up. It wasn't just an order. It was arrogance. It was bias. It was the belief that he had the power to do whatever he pleased, even if it meant pointing a gun at a highly decorated black military general. At a funeral, beside him, the younger officer, Officer Bradley, hesitated. His hand wavered near his holster, his entire stance uneasy. He wasn't so sure anymore, because something was very, very wrong. And in the next few seconds, everything was about to change. Sergeant Harper's grip on his weapon tightened, his knuckles turning white. His breath came in short, agitated bursts, but still, he didn't lower his gun. Sergeant, I don't think this is right, Officer Bradley stammered, his nervous blue eyes darting between Harper and the sea of horrified soldiers. His voice wavered, uncertainty creeping into his posture. But Harper? He wasn't listening. He wasn't thinking. His entire focus was locked on one thing: General Nathaniel Carter, a man he had convinced himself was a threat. Carter exhaled slowly. 3 wars. Countless missions. Assassination attempts, bombings, firefights in the deadliest corners of the world. He had faced the enemy under blistering suns, in the freezing cold, in places where death was as common as the air they breathed. And yet, here he was, standing on American soil, at the funeral of a fallen soldier, being treated like an enemy. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because of the color of his skin. The other officers and soldiers stood frozen, silent witnesses to something they never imagined they would see. Many had served under Carter. They had heard his speeches, followed his commands, entrusted him with their lives. Some of them owed their lives to him. Yet none of that seemed to matter to Sergeant Harper. Finally, Carter spoke, his voice dangerously quiet. I'll give you one more chance, he said, his words like steel, cutting through the thick tension. Lower your weapon. Harper let out a short, humorless scoff. That's not how this works. I give the orders here. Carter's lips barely moved, but his voice carried an undeniable weight. No, Sergeant. You don't. That single statement sent a ripple of unease through the gathered crowd. Even Officer Bradley was visibly sweating now. He turned toward Harper, his voice laced with urgency. Sergeant, sir, I really think we should. Shut up, Bradley. Harper snapped, his frustration boiling over. His finger twitched near the trigger. The soldiers standing nearby stiffened. Muscles tensed. It wouldn't take much. One wrong move, one sharp breath, one tiny miscalculation, and an innocent man would be shot. But Carter? He didn't flinch. His battle-hardened expression remained unreadable. His gaze locked onto Harper's unshaken. And then, at last, he spoke again. What exactly do you think I did? The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Harper sneered. His jaw clenched, his arrogance unwavering. I don't take orders from people like you. A few gasps rippled through the funeral attendees. Harper's voice was filled with something ugly as he spat his next words. This is a military funeral. You're not supposed to be here. The accusation dripped with unspoken meaning. Carter blinked once. A slow, deliberate motion. People like me? Harper didn't back down. If anything, his grip on the weapon tightened, his stance growing more rigid. You don't belong here. he said through gritted teeth. You were acting suspicious. Standing too close to the casket, whispering something. Carter almost laughed. He had whispered a prayer before stepping forward. A simple prayer. And yet, in Harper's eyes, a black man standing at the front of a funeral, mourning the loss of a brother-in-arms, was enough to assume something sinister. The other officers looked appalled. Some turned to each other, their expressions twisted with disbelief. But Harper? He wasn't done. Now, I won't say it again. His voice was sharp. Get on the ground. That was it. That was the breaking point. Carter's gaze, sharp as a blade, swept over the scene. And suddenly, he didn't have to move. He didn't have to raise his voice. But somehow, the power in the air shifted. It was no longer Harper who held control of this moment. It was him. And his next words? They changed everything. Sergeant Harper, he said, his voice deadly calm. Do you even know who you just drew your weapon on? Harper scoffed, rolling his eyes. Doesn't matter. The law is the law. A slow, dangerous smirk spread across Carter's face. Wrong answer. And with that, the tension detonated into something Harper never saw coming. For the first time since pulling his weapon, Harper hesitated. It was subtle, a flicker in his eyes, the tiniest shift in his stance, but it was there. Because something in Carter's tone, something in the way he stood unshaken in the face of a loaded gun, made him falter. And then, the whispers began. The murmurs spread through the crowd like wildfire. Soldiers exchanged stunned glances. Officers leaned in, whispering urgently amongst themselves. He doesn't know who that is. He's a damn idiot if he doesn't. Harper's own partner, Officer Bradley, looked like he wanted to crawl into the nearest grave. His face had gone ghostly pale. His jaw was clenched so tightly it looked painful. He darted a glance toward the gathered soldiers, men and women standing tall in full uniform, their medals and ranks gleaming under the gray light. This wasn't just any funeral. And General Nathaniel Carter? He wasn't just a man in a suit. Then, a new voice sliced through the murmurs like a blade. Sergeant Harper. Everyone turned. Colonel Davis. She stepped forward from the honor guard, her posture unwavering, her sharp, steely gaze locking onto Harper with the weight of authority. A woman of discipline. A soldier adorned with medals and ribbons that demanded respect. Her next words sent a shockwave through the cemetery. Do you realize you're pointing your weapon at a 4-star general? Silence. Absolute. Deafening. Silence. And in that single moment, Harper's face changed. His arrogant sneer faltered. His eyes flickered with something new. Confusion? Doubt? Fear? No, he muttered, shaking his head. No, that's... But Colonel Davis didn't blink. Didn't hesitate. She simply lifted her gloved hand and pointed right at the 4 silver stars shining on Carter's uniform. 4 stars that outranked everyone present. 4 stars that made it undeniable. A strangled, stunned noise escaped Harper's throat. And just like that, everything he thought he knew came crashing down.